I'm Neil Davenport, I'm chairing this session, The Nation State in the Modern World. Now, I think for over 20 years, international relations departments at universities have often presented the nation state as simply a malignant vehicle for governments to attack citizens to deny their rights. It is often considered far better to have transnational organisations that can enforce human rights and thus protect the individual. Elsewhere, globalization theories have said that the nation state is out of date. Countries are now interconnected more than ever, and the notion of borders has simply become a quaint relic of the 19th century. Now, that kind of debate took place in academia, but I think since the Brexit result last year, this has become part of the critical mass of society, whereby there's a hostility towards the nation state, and national sovereignty has become quite central to the ongoing Remain discussion. For many who consider themselves as progressive, they will associate the nation state as being intolerant. Support for the nation state is said to be insular, petty, narrow-minded, xenophobic, and even racist. Now, in certain historical periods, nationalism can certainly be exclusive, it can be aggressive, and it can be divisive. But I think that a belief that a nation can self-determine its own destiny, and the people of that nation determining its own destiny, once defined modern liberal society. For many radicals, they once wanted to champion the right of all nations to exercise self-determination. Today, I think the boundaries between a reactionary and a progressive form of nationalism has become all too blurred, whereby I think proposing self-government and national sovereignty is automatically associated with a mean-spirited and ugly chauvinism. So in this session, I think we want to explore whether the critics of the nation-state are right. Is it simply an outdated mode of organising human society, and that transnational integration is the best way of guaranteeing rights and world peace? Or is it the case that the nation-state remains the most effective way of guaranteeing natural rights, and that a cultural belonging of a people based on religion, customs or language can be a unifying rather than divisive force? Now, to explore some of these issues, we have two outstanding speakers. On my left, we have Angie Hobbs. She's Professor of the Public Understanding of Philosophy at the University of Sheffield, and she's going to be speaking first. To my right, we have a Battle of Ideas regular, Professor Frank Furedi, sociologist and social commentator, author of On Tolerance, Invitation to Terror, and whose latest book, Populism and the European Culture Wars, explores some of the issues that we're going to take a look at today. So, Angie, if you'd like to start, please.
Thank you. Well, Einstein may have said that nationalism is the measles of mankind, but that kind of glib statement isn't really going to help us address the very profound issues and challenges facing the world today. So what we're going to do today is have a much deeper and I hope more subtle debate. If we're going to understand the kind of reasons people might care about a nation state and healthy and unhealthy ways of doing that, we first need to look at some of the reasons people might care about the notion of a nation and unhealthy ways of that kind of care. If we start with the root of the word nation in the Latin natio, which means birth or being born, we can see that initially it stemmed from the idea of what kind of ethnic group you came from. So that is true. The absolute Latin roots do come from a notion of ethnicity. However, really quickly, including in the Roman Republic and then Empire, the notion of tribe became overlaid with all sorts of other factors which bind the tribe together. Shared values, customs, traditions, laws, language, for instance, and indeed often the place with which the tribe was associated. So really quickly, the notion of an ethnic tribe gets overlaid with all sorts of geographical notions and cultural notions. Now, as we all know, sometime between the 16th and 18th centuries, in particular, the idea of political national sovereignty also gets included in the notion of the modern nation state is born. Now, why might you care about a nation before we get on to the nation state? If you've had good experiences, if you've had a happy childhood, if you've been lucky in your experiences of life, you might feel a sense of affinity, a sense of sharing at least most of the values of the place or group, community into which you were born. You might feel that you're at home there. You might feel a sense of gratitude. You might want to honour the traditions of your ancestors. But even if you've had a miserable experience, even if your community or place has treated you badly, rejected you, or even if factors outside anybody's control, such as plague or famine, have just given you unhappy memories, your view, your image of your community, your place, your nation is part of your personal identity, part of the personal narrative that you tell about yourself. And the same is true with your attachment to a nation state as well. Whether you love your nation state, hate it, reject it, want never to see it again, it's part of your personal narrative. And we might have other reasons for caring about a nation state which go beyond that, which might be to do with we think this is a good vehicle for doing good, we think it makes democracy accountable, and so on. But the crucial point I want to emphasise is that we all have a very deep psychological need for a sense of identity, and it makes no sense for some on the left to say, and I regard myself as on the centre left, but for some of the left to say, let's just get rid of identity politics. That's not going to work. People have a deep psychological need for a sense of identity. The challenge is, how do we tell personal narratives that are healthy rather than unhealthy? We also need to remember that the image that we build up of our nation is immensely selective. Given the overlay of issues to do with tribe, place, shared cultural values, language, laws, and so on, nobody gets all of that into their image of their own particular nation or nation state. We're hugely selective, whether consciously or unconsciously. As a result, no two people on the planet are going to have exactly the same image of any one nation. And that goes for nationalists of the most extreme kind, even if they're in the same political group and even if they have the same political ambitions. They will have different images of the nation to which they feel either attached or which they feel is in some part of their personal narrative. Crucially, this image of a nation, and indeed of a nation state, may partly be formed by its relations with other nations. And that's the most important metaphysical point I want to get over. That if you're trying to form an image of a nation, its relations with other nations might be part of the image that you're forming, might be a crucial part of how you see your nation and its identity. Your image of your nation will also intersect with images of many other communities to which you may feel are important to you. Your family, your village, town or city, your island, a federation of nations, a continent, the whole world. That we all have multiple layered identities, and that is nothing new. It's prefigured, for instance, in ancient Rome. An ancient Roman would have felt a very strong affinity to his or her family, the village or town from which they came, the city of Rome, the whole Roman Empire. If they'd also been philosophically a Roman Stoic, they would have felt an affinity to the whole cosmopolis, the whole world community of rational beings. So this isn't new, this notion of multiple layered identities, and you don't necessarily have to exclude one or the other. What then can we do what can we deduce from all this about healthy and unhealthy ways of forming attachment to a nation and indeed a nation states? We can deduce that if we want our nation to flourish, that can only be brought about by acknowledging and celebrating our ties with other nations. Ties of politics, of course, the environment, trade, security, and so on. Such flourishing will not, cannot come from a policy of Britain first, or America first, or Germany first, or Spain or Catalonia first. Such flourishing can only come by acknowledging and celebrating our shared ties, our shared destinies. Internally, as a nation usually, not always, but usually involves a notion of place as well. Of course, there are nations that are not attached necessarily to one place, but usually there is. Internally, therefore, a nation will involve the idea of territory, and a flourishing nation will not seek to oppose any groups that inhabit that same territory. The flourishing nation, therefore, will embrace an ideal of civic nationhood, which could be moderately left, it could be moderately right-wing. There's a fairly wide spectrum over which it could go, which is fundamentally bonded in the present by shared values and goals and the rule of law, and is no longer tied to ethnic origins that may have once existed. What we need to remember is that in any nation state, as in any nation, change is inevitable. The boundaries of it change. The internal makeup, ethnic and other and religious, of its inhabitants change. Its constitution will certainly change over time. So we need to accept that the notion of a nation, and indeed the notion of a nation state, is to some extent an imagined notion. And I mean, I'm not denying the political realities of nation states, but to some extent it is imagined. We all have this as part of our own personal narrative. What we need to do individually is think, how can I tell a truthful, accurate, nuanced narrative about the history, the actuality of my nation and nation state, and see how I fit into that? And if we do that, we will see how deeply interconnected we are, both within the nation and between nations. So as a result, what can't happen is a view that international bodies, transnational bodies that, like the United Nations, can only exist if they are founded very strongly on notions of strong, separate, discrete nation states, which is as close to a foreign policy as Trump has ever got. And that's being very generous to him. Yes, politically discrete in terms of sovereignty, but hugely interconnected in so many other ways. And that is why, for our nations to flourish, to care about our nation in healthy ways, we accept, we celebrate that interconnectivity. Thank you.
Okay, Frank.
I really struggle with the question of nationality and the nation state. One of the reasons why I struggle with it is all my life I've been very suspicious of the nation state. I've been highly suspicious of different forms of nationalism. And yet I find myself in my declining years sort of having a rethink about it for a number of reasons to do with the world we live in. I think it's important to realize that if we go back in history, the 19th century was really the century of the nation state in terms of emerging and acquiring this kind of predominant global influence. By the time you get to the 20th century, it's more a century of ideologies, and it ends up being more or less a century of globalization. I think one of the things that people often overlook is that the nation state itself has, over these years, lost a lot of its dynamic. It's worth knowing that, for example, the nation state totally failed in Africa. I mean, African nationalism gave way to other kind of political manifestations, separatist, tribalist, ethnic. It failed in the Middle East, where Arab nationalism eventually gave way to something very, very different, radically different, as we can see today. And in many parts of the world, it's really just kind of there as an empty shell. And you can see this by the fact that when you travel around, even Western Europe, people find it very difficult to explain what it means to be British, what it means to be French, or what it means to be Dutch. And whenever the government tries to put on a British values course in the schools, it soon gives up because it hasn't got an account of what these things kind of really mean. So, we're talking about institutions that are very weak, and often when people say that nationalism is a problem because it's very strong, I think they live in a parallel universe. I think nationalism, compared to most historical periods in the past, is conspicuously weak. And even when you take into account some of the reverberations that are going on in Spain today, for example, in Catalonia or the Liga Lombardy, they really are, the passion behind them is very, very different than what we associate with a powerful nationalistic kind of movement. So why defend the nation state under these circumstances when it appears to be so incapable of standing up for itself, of giving an account of itself, of giving an explanation of what it is really all about? I think the reason why I've been drawn towards seeing the nation as really, really important is because the alternatives tend to be far worse. So, for example, I've become very, very suspicious of international institutions, principally because of their lack of accountability to any kind of demos or to any kind of people. I've become very concerned with that international organizations, in a sense, end up outsourcing politics to a group of individuals who are, then gain authority without having been elected or having put their arguments forward. And I do get worried the way in which there's a kind of new notion of cosmopolitanism that has emerged. I mean, I think of myself as being cosmopolitan in the old school way, like Immanuel Kant was, or in the way that some of the old Enlightenment people used to think about it, where cosmopolitanism actually meant a recognition of different nations, a recognition that you wanted to create a kind of humanistic world outlook, but on the basis of actually enjoying the different national experiences that have emerged over a period of time. Today's cosmopolitanism I call globalism, where essentially you kind of develop a set of institutions and values that prides itself on the fact that it's insulated from democracy. And I think you can see this in the European Union. If you look at the history of the European Union was set up as an institution that celebrated the diversity of European nations. And the initial way that diversity was used in the European Union was to say we have French people, German people, English people, and it's really good that we're able to kind of draw upon those national cultures. By the time you get to today, in the 21st century, diversity means something very different. Because in the European Union, what you celebrate is either regionalism, regional identities of various sorts, or alternatively, sort of ethnic or gender or other kind of identities. But the one identity that isn't celebrated in the European Union are national ones. And therefore, the idea of diversity is fundamentally altered to something very, very different. And I think this is where I find myself troubled. Because I think that one of the things that we've seen, and this is something I've just written a book about, is almost a kind of an unwitting, semi-conscious process that's all working towards the same direction, which is to denationalize identity. I think the one identity that is usually pathologized is national identity. I think every other identity is okay. It's really cool. You can have multiple identities of various sorts. But the one identity that appears to carry a very serious ideological baggage is that of national identity. And people who identify with the nation, who have a measure of patriotism, who have what we call in my language of birth Hungarian, a kind of a national feeling, are often seen as being at the beginning of a spectrum that eventually leads to xenophobia and then finally to Kristallnacht. And when you look at all the accounts that we have of nationalism at the moment, you see the language and the analysis has changed. Because when I was an undergraduate at university, and I took my course on nationalism, they used to teach us about good and bad nationalism, ethnic and civil nationalism. They made a distinction between patriotism and other forms of aggressive, racist forms of nationalism. And you kind of recognize that there was a variety of different ways that national sentiments could be expressed. When you look at the literature today on nationalism, it's all pathologized. It's very rare that you come across nationalism as having any kind of redeeming features, or that you recognize that having a sense of a place, of patriotism that's nationally bounded rather than regionally bounded or gender bounded or something else could have any kind of positive element to that. Now, why is this a problem? And I think the reason why it's a problem for me isn't because I feel I don't feel British, for obvious reasons. I don't feel anything. If anything, I feel European. Probably I feel more European than anything else. So why do I think that nation is so important? I think that the reason why national consciousness and national identity is so significant is because at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, it's only within the context of a border that people's sense of place can acquire a reality, have a meaning. It's only within the confines of a particular sort of nation state that people's sense of who they are can begin to acquire some kind of a political expression. Because it's only within the context of a nation state that, whether we like it or not, that popular sovereignty or any kind of democracy could actually function. It may well be there may well be an argument that actually even a nation state is too big for exercising popular sovereignty, and a lot of people have put forward that argument. But whatever you think about this debate as to whether it's the nation state or the city state or whatever, the one thing that we can be all certain about is that if you go beyond the nation state, in other words, if you get to a supranational or a transnational arrangement, then democracy by definition acquires an empty character. And it's interesting that if you look at the literature written by people like Jürgen Habermas or a lot of German, what they call constitutional patriots, who argue for creating a democracy in the confines of a larger union, a transnational union. If you look at their contribution, they all make the point that actually what we're doing here is we're depoliticizing democracy. We're allowing the courts, for example, to have a much greater say about decision making than is the case at the moment. We're allowing the experts in different institutions to have a greater input about social and civic affairs. And the minute you do that, what you're really saying is that, is that politics is really the responsibility of certain types of people and not of others. And we go back to the very beginning of this discussion back in ancient Greeks, when Socrates gets up and he says, why is it, that when it comes to shipbuilding, we rely on expert shipbuilders? Why is it that when we come to building houses, we rely on expert architects? But yet, when it comes to the polis, when it comes to politics, we allow everybody to be an expert. Why don't we just rely on political experts? And through Plato, through the mouth of Socrates, raised the anti-democratic argument before there is a democratic argument. And I think that's pretty much what's happening in the world that we live in today, where increasingly the denationalization of identity comes with the pretty conscious attempt to outsource democracy and democratic decision-making to institutions that are really not accountable to the rest of society. And I think under those circumstances, we do need to begin to value the nation-state a little bit more. But of course, we can have a big discussion and a debate as to how we want to express our sense of place, what kind of meaning we want to give to what is that binds us together. And I'm convinced that if we do that, then we can have a sense of national feeling, which isn't based upon creating hostility and aggression towards other people, but also recognizes that we are part of a nation, but we're also part of humanity. And then those two things, I think, are not mutually contradictory.
Okay, we don't have a great deal of time, so I'm going to throw it out straight to the audience.
Thank you very much. This is a topic that I do really struggle with in terms of what I think about it. But a couple of things that both speakers said. Frank, you said nationalism without hostility, and Angie, you talked about unhealthy and healthy attachments. I read a book by Linda Coley, Britain's The Birth of a Nation, which I thought was fascinating. And she said two central aspects of what it means to be British that were really central in the 1700s. One was Protestantism, and the other one was the anti-French. But she did not see the anti-French. And when I read it, I thought, well, the anti-French side, it's not that problematic, because it was anti-French in the sense of, you French, you're superstitious, you French, you're unfree, you French, you are exploited, and so rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never ever shall be slaves, was like pointing to the French. So can't there even be something positive when it's hostile? Or
I was wondering if you could both comment on the kind of current or ongoing refugee crisis and how this has undermined the nation state in many ways. So if you take the example of Hungary, Frank, where they've been overruled by the EU basically about putting up fences, not allow people to trudge across their national space. And then you have the political reaction against that, obviously. But also if you look at what the EU's also done in trying to say, oh, well, don't worry, you register in the place you land, and then we'll divvy all you people out to whoever we deem it's fair to give you all to. And I think also in the British sense, there's a contrast to that, is that we're apart geographically and politically as well in many ways. We're also quite confused about what we're bringing people into. So if you look back at kind of Blair and multiculturalism, blah, 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 which, if you come to the festival, we've already talked about many times, we're confused about what we're letting people into. So as a nation state, how can we allow these immigrants to come in and to be a part of who we are? I guess you can talk about that from your own experience as well, Frank.
Although I didn't realise it at the time, about 6 or 7 years before the fall of the Soviet Union, I saw what was coming when I was on board a Soviet warship, and I noticed that this was a system of no common national identity imposed purely by force. What was holding it together was purely by force. Remove that force and it's going to collapse. My question is, how do organizations which reject having a liberal, to use a much used word today, and I think still to come, nationalist with a small n identity, how are they going to cope, be particularly multinational organisations, but also national organisations, when you're dealing with the hard men who are back, if they ever went away, from orthodox Russian nationalism, Han Chinese nationalism, and in a more moderate form, Hindu Indian nationalism, countries which are stretched along the trade routes, and China, by some accounts, on purchasing power parity, is the world's largest economy. To coin an old phrase, they haven't gone away, you know.
I'd just like to quickly introduce the concept of, rather than the nation state, the state nation. So this concept of countries like Canada and Belgium, where rather than kind of the nation being primary above the state is primary above the nation, and you have different regional values which are all placed of equal importance in the country. Do you think this is a more appropriate system for modern times in which nationalism is more stigmatized? But also, there has been a lot of talk about how transnational organizations or supranational organizations are doing away with the nation state, how they are a political revolution in a way. Surely, from a nation-state perspective, they are just an extension of kind of having to have these shared values like the EU does with its liberal democratic ideals, supposedly, thus as a justification for excluding Turkey. And from a state-nation point of view, it's a set of separate cultures underneath one multinational state. Sure, is this kind of transnational revolution actually a revolution at all, or is it just a more grandiose version of the nation state or state nation?
Do you believe that nation states are a forced down approach from the top to bottom? As if you look at German nationalism, Italian nationalism, and Arab nationalism, they were all created through people not trying to actually unify a nation under one banner, but to consolidate their own power, such as Prussia. With the Italians, Sardinia wanted to unite the countries under their own rule. The Italians didn't want to unite. And under Gamal Abdel Nasser, he wanted to unite the Arabs under his identity of Arab nationalism. There wasn't a grand call for a united identity. Do you believe that it was more of a forced-down approach upon people of nation-states?
Okay, so I'm going to start with, I want to make a distinction between transnationalism and supranationalism, because there's a difference between working between states and organisations like the United Nations, which assume a nation state, and that's the building block, and you look to form different kinds of bonds between states, and that's very distinct from the notion of something that's supranational, that works over and above a nation state. Alexander the Great's desire to rule the world, to pick up the point that was just last made. We have to be very wary of people who want to create ever and ever bigger blocks. In terms of, I don't think Frank and I disagree that keeping hold of a nation state is important as an administrative vehicle, as a practical vehicle for doing good, for keeping people in power accountable, for keeping the mechanisms of power democratic. We might have some slight shifts of opinion in how we see the relations between states. Can hostile nationalism ever be helpful? No. But, there is a but, that doesn't mean that you have to absolutely just go along with whatever traditions or shared cultural sort of values or historical memories that another culture says, these are our cultures, we have to respect these, it's all fine, it's our tradition. No, you don't. I mean, there are some things which, as an ethical philosopher, I would say are just demonstrably, sorry, I can't speak. I won't even try to say it, provably wrong. For instance, female genital mutilation. I have no truck with any sort of tradition which says this is part of our tradition, let's hang on to this is part of our national or any other community culture. So the fact that you can respect the notion of wanting to feel at home in a particular community in principle and wanting in general to honour and respect the traditions of different communities doesn't mean you have to say that absolutely every tradition is right. So you can critique other nations, you can critique the behaviour of other nations, indeed we should. So robustly critical nationalism is fine. Questioning nationalism is fine, both ourselves and others, but hostile nationalism, no, I don't ever see a role for that. In terms of the kinds of, there was a very interesting question about the EU and the sort of the borders going up and migration in the EU. I work a lot in Italy and Greece, and the biggest question being discussed in a lot of Europe, particularly Southern Europe at the moment, is not, surprise, surprise, Brexit or anything to do with Britain, particularly its immigration and the migration crisis. And certainly the EU, personally, I would have liked us to remain a part of it. I'm, on the whole, a fan of it, but it is not doing nearly enough to help the nations like Greece and Italy, who are getting hundreds of thousands. It is a shocking disgrace. We are not doing nearly enough. As a result, the wrong kind of borders are being erected. We're seeing barbed wire, high barbed wire fences around the place. We're having threats of walls being built. Of course, we need borders between nations, but I would, to use a metaphorical term, I would rather those borders were flowering hedges with gates in them rather than walls. I'm speaking metaphorically, obviously, but there are ways of hanging on to the importance of the nation state as a vehicle and keeping the importance of international and transnational organizations, because the environment is a global issue. Migration is a global issue. Finance, social media, what's going on with huge social media companies, these are global issues. We can't tackle them all on our own. We have to have international bodies, but not, I would say, supranational bodies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Frank, do you want to come back on any of the audience's questions?
Yeah, I think the key question here is not to speculate about what kind of nationalism is good or bad, or which one we would prefer, but to recognize the importance of the principle of national sovereignty. And the reason why national sovereignty is important is simply because it's the medium through which popular sovereignty or democracy can have any meaning. Without national sovereignty, democracy becomes merely a rhetorical accomplishment, rather than anything else. I think we always got to get back to that point, because obviously the history of nations and nation states is very messy, and nation states are always the creation of the elites, who are on top. It's always done for projecting their power, their own class interest. People aren't innocently building nation states for the good of everybody. I would say it's the same thing with transnational organizations as well. They too represent certain interests. They're not innocent organizations that somehow are insulated from any specific lobbies or groups. They're just as much like any other organization in that respect, except in one respect, which they're less democratic than state institutions, because at least we can have the possibility of getting rid of our leaders within the state, but we don't have that option left when it comes to a transnational organization. And I think that was really shown in the EU migration thing, because the way I would say it is that whatever you think of the migration question, we did have a very big problem there. The problem was that, here you have a very major issue confronting the world, not just Europe, but the world. But the response to this major challenge to the world was not seen as something that you and I or anybody else could make an input into. In other words, the policy that we would want to have in relation to migration was never put to the German electorate or to the British electorate or to anybody else. It was a policy that was kind of dreamt up and cooked up, probably overnight, by Merkel and a few of her advisors, which then is kind of projected onto the rest of Europe. And it seems to me that here what you have is two huge problems. One is it becomes a horrible way of dealing with the migration issue. And secondly, it becomes a way of excluding people whose lives will be fundamentally affected by this development from making any decisions about how they deal with it. So for me, the migration issue was a very good example as to why either the EU had to change, or alternatively, we had to find a more nationally oriented way of dealing with these things. Because my position is that when you have a decision that involves the lives of millions of people, then you have to basically consult the electorate. Now, I would have been arguing for a generous migration policy within the context of that. But the debate had to have been had out by the people of Europe rather than imposed upon it, Because if you do that, then what you end up is the worst of all possible worlds. You will end up with people who will react, perhaps in the wrong kind of a way, who will draw very kind of negative kind of conclusions and become anti-migrant as a result of that. And secondly, you will have a situation where you will never get a kind of balanced approach towards that. I think that one of the tragedies that has occurred within the European context and within our society is that we've lost the capacity or the belief that on these difficult matters, people can be consulted. A lot of politicians I talk to would tell me, you know, Frank, what you say is absolutely right in principle, but in practice, would you allow the people to vote on capital punishment? You know, we don't let them vote on capital punishments because they will vote the wrong way, right? That's why Parliament decides. And similarly, they say, you know, for the very same reason, we wouldn't let the people vote on it because they will vote the wrong kind of way. In other words, the presumption is they're so racist that they wouldn't let a single migrant come into their society. That's the presumption. And my argument is actually, at the end of the day, you know, democracy means you win arguments, you lose arguments, but you have the arguments out. And in that way, it's only in that way that positive, even progressive, even future-oriented outcomes can ever be kind of realized.
So I have a question about the kind of nationalistic policies of a lot of leaders in the last kind of few years that have popped up. Do you think that that is a political ploy to just appeal to the fear of the other, or is there a genuine fear of the other in the electorate and they're not just being like brainwashed or, I guess, manipulated by politicians, and that people genuinely fear migrants or people coming into their country, both in Europe, in the US, and in any other country that this is related to? Thank you.
My comment relates to the alternatives to the nation state, because the current alternative is a world of blocks. So to take both your research areas, the Greek city-states should have given up and should never have fought the Persian Empire, because already they were an atavistic form. They didn't realise you needed to be part of blocks to succeed in the world. And similarly, Frank, in terms of the Hungarian Revolution, obviously 1956 should never have happened, because the Hungarians should have realised they were in a world of blocks and nation states don't make any sense. And I think that this is what unfortunately has been argued today, that we have to be a world of blocks and we can't be independent communities. But at the same time, what's happening in that world of blocks is the reality that actually states still matter. And the migrant crisis told us that nation states still matter, because it was very clear that those migrants, having given up on their own nation state, were very clearly heading towards what they viewed as the most stable nation states, the most prosperous nation states that could offer them a national welfare service and a thriving economy. Because what was really striking about the migrant crisis for those countries along the Western Balkan route was that experience of the migrants telling them that their society was a no man's land with no future. And so I think we need to sort of really, that crisis was a real serious wake-up call for the meaning of political communities and the sort of what future people are being offered.
Just kind of thinking about the migration crisis that we've been speaking about, and this kind of tension between kind of a transcending identity and a specific nation identity. And it's interesting that in Eastern Europe at the moment, there seems to be, like, the kind of re-emergence of a strong nation-state identity seems to be kind of coupled with kind of investing history with a lot more significant ultimate meaning. I'm thinking in particular of the Visegrad Four, but also notions that are coming back of protecting a particular Christian culture, dare I even say it, the notion of a Christendom, against an external transcending culture that is kind of bathed in a clash. Now, that being the case, is it not interesting that the transcending identity is what's giving, like, the flesh to the nation-state identity, or is that just a massive paradox? I mean, is this just a contradiction in terms?
My question is relating to someone who just did a comment about the fear of the other and whether it's all brainwashing. And you guys didn't strictly speak about that, but I want to respond to it really. I'm from Peckham in southeast London, and I grew up in a council estate, multicultural community, and I would say that fear of the other is very real in those kinds of communities. You've all heard of the term white flight. Well, I can say that from my experience, being of mixed race as well, all of the white working class has moved out of areas like that because they don't feel very welcome. So these are the very real lived experiences of the original communities of places like England. And what we're seeing now is they're all moving out of London, or they're moving to places and forming these kind of more homogenous communities as a response because they are not feeling very welcome anymore. I don't really want to make it about race because it's not just about race, but that is what came to mind when she mentioned fear of the other. So if you can comment on that, that would be great.
My question's about how, if you make the defence of national sovereignty, the nation-state can evolve over time. I mean, if you look historically, I mean, borders have always been quite fluid, you know, Prussia, then Germany, etc. So to what extent, if you make the argument for borders and for national sovereignty, can you allow any development of those borders over time? And I think even though someone in the audience mentioned the idea of the kind of the world of blocks at the moment, on the other side, to the other pole, you also at the moment have a lot of fragmentation going on. So of course you have Scotland wanting to leave the UK, you have Catalonia wanting to leave Spain, you even have Canvey Island, where I'm from in Essex, wanting to leave the rest of Essex. Now I would argue, of course, that they should remain. But at the same time, you do see, some very strong voices on on the streets of Catalonia at the moment, saying that they have a much stronger affiliation and feel kind of much more part of Catalonia than they do the rest of Spain, and feel quite divorced and estranged from democracy in Spain, especially given the treatment by the kind of Spanish government of the Catalonian nationals over the last few weeks. So, to what extent, could they ever have a case for kind of their own national sovereignty apart from Spain? It's a question that I'm kind of wrestling with at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Just going to bring the panellists in. Frank, do you want to respond?
Well, I don't want to go into that, but I think that you have to recognize the right of people determine their future. At the moment, I think in Catalonia it's far from clear, what the people want to do there, but it would have a destructive consequence, obviously. But borders do change, and I think that is self-evident. I just want to come back on your question on the other. I think the real problem that we have in terms of national cultures is that we adopted multiculturalism rather than assimilationism, because I think that in a civilized society, you're very generous to people coming into your society. You're quite welcoming, and we all know that it's really good to have different types of people living alongside of you, but you all expect everybody to sign up to the same rules. And I think that when I became a refugee in Canada, I became Canadian really, really fast. And even though I felt Hungarian as well, but we all wanted to be Canadians as fast as possible. And that was a way in which we could have a common conversation. We didn't have that kind of segmented, segregated life that you have in many English communities. If you go up north to Bradford, places like that, it is scary how people live live in segmented community and never mix with each other. So I think Europe has got to rediscover assimilation. I think that's really important as part of creating the kind of identity. And that doesn't mean that you cannot be somebody else as well. It couldn't have a different kind of religion, but it does mean that you get rid of multiculturalism, because that just has led to the world that we live in as being wholly destructive, in my opinion. Well meant, but wholly destructive. I want to say a few things about East Europe. I've just spent a year in Hungary, where I was born, and it is very interesting because, contrary to the way, first of all, I think you have to understand why Hungarians react the way they do. If you're a Hungarian person, and you look back on the past, and you've been occupied just very recently by Russia, just before that you've been occupied by the Germans, before that you were occupied by the Austrians, and before that you were occupied by the Turks, right? And really it's only since the 90s that a sense of independent Hungary has first begun to occur. And therefore I think when Hungarians look at their borders, they are reminded of something profoundly important to them, which is they want to be in control of their lives. And I think that I would say that I can totally understand why Hungarians freak out at the idea that somehow they need to open up their borders or in some shape or form subjugate themselves to the dictates of what kind of Brussels says. And I just think it's unfortunate that because of that you have this horrible polarization of political opinion. I also think that Hungarians, like East Europeans, actually think of themselves as being more European than the EU. In fact, one of the critiques that Poles make, that Hungarians make, that Czechs make, is actually we're standing up for European values, Christianity mentioned, being one of them. And from their standpoints, they're the real Europeans, and the European Union is a globalist organization that stands for nothing particularly European. And if you look at the EU's own Museum of History in Brussels, history begins in 1945. Right? It's a year zero. There's no history before that for a very simple reason. It embarrasses the European Union. I mean, the European Union couldn't even summon up the courage to put Christianity as part of the European legacy. Now, I'm not a Christian. I'm an atheist. I'm not even Christian by family connections even. But the idea that somehow you're too embarrassed to recognize that Christianity is part of the European heritage indicates just how removed it has become from the overall experience. So I really think that we've got to look at East Europe a little bit differently. We should be critical of them. A lot of their policies are really horrible. But by and large, we also have to understand that the reason why they're reacting the way they do is not because they become fervent nationalists, because I think on the streets of Budapest or Warsaw, people are not particularly nationalist. It's because they're sick and tired of being lectured at by Westerners and Europeans telling them how to lead their lives and what kind of values they should live by. And I think what you're seeing there's a backlash to what they see as people who are trying to impose their culture over their way of life.
Okay.
Thank you. I think one of the reasons I feel so European, amongst other things, is that I started off studying Latin and Greek, so I feel very immersed in the pre-Christian roots of European culture. So I want a return of Dionysus and Aphrodite and Artemis. Those are my gods. I wanted to pick up right at the beginning. The very first question we had was a lady who talked about why we got this sort of resurgence in politicians making appeals to my nation first and this kind of nationalism. Well, I still think that 2007 and 2008, we had a lot to answer for. Global capitalism hasn't worked for everybody, and there is a lot of quite justifiable anger around the world, and some very cynical, opportunistic politicians have sought to redirect that anger onto often the wrong targets. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with what Frank says about people's need to feel affiliated to nations and nation states, but a lot of the anger at the moment is because, I think, through a very, very profoundly mishandled financial crisis. Now, there was a question here about were Frank and I arguing for sort of everything to be taken over by blocs? I think not at all. I think I understood both Frank and I to be saying that actually, properly understood, the nation state is still a helpful political vehicle if it's approached in the right way. I mean, to go back, you talked about the Greeks and standing up to the Persian Empire. Well, the reason they were able to do that was because Athens and Sparta and Boeotia, and Corinth and Argos, for a short time got together and formed the Delian League. So that was the reason they were able to defeat the Persians finally in 470 BC. They did form a league, and when that league disintegrated and Sparta and Athens started fighting each other, it all went horribly wrong, and then they were taken over by the Macedonian Empire. So, I mean, it is possible to care deeply about a nation state and still understand that that nation state is only going to thrive with healthy relations with other nations and nation states in the world, and through membership of some international and transnational bodies as well. And then now, a lot of people have mentioned Canada. I've spent a lot of time in Canada, and I'm a big fan of Canada. And I agree. I like the notion of a state nation. I like the notion that if you want to become Canadian, there's certain core values you have to sign up to. You have to publicly sign up to. I think I'm fine with that, and I think you can still hang on to an awful lot about your heritage and your tradition and your culture. And as indeed is the case in Canada, I think they get the balance, I know they make mistakes sometimes, but on the whole, they get the balance between allowing the different communities in Canada to hold on to different traditional ways of life while standing up for some core values. I find that a helpful way to go, and I think it's a way of, it's not entirely multicultural, and it's what Frank was talking about. I agree with Frank that absolutely undiluted, unthought through, unreflective multiculturalism is problematic. That if you're going to share the same geographical space, there need to be a few core values, if only a commitment to free speech and discussing those core values.
Just to explain something, one of the motivations for running this session, and I think Frank touched upon this in his introduction, is just the one-sided way in which nationalism is now discussed. It has completely disappeared, the idea of national self-determination being a progressive and positive force in society. It's often forgotten how anti-colonialism had its roots in a progressive form of nationalism as well. So it'd be interesting what the audience has got to say about as to why is this the case? Why has standing up for national self-determination as the best way of protecting rights and liberties, why has that now been viewed in a very sort of jaundiced way? So I'd be interested in any comments on that, because that was the motivation for running this session. But feel free to comment on anything else, but I thought I'd throw that in.
My issue really around this is that if we are saying the nation state is a useful set of, a useful starting point to have a say, then we have an immediate problem in that our say is always mediated through the state itself. So the migrants or the refugees arriving, in Europe, their experience was the hostility of the state and crashing literally into policemen and borders and such like. And anywhere in Eastern Europe, I haven't been to Hungary, but further east, people's experience of the state is that it's extremely vicious and extremely hostile. And even in this country, as a liberal, relatively liberal and easy place to live, as soon as you cross a border, my hackles rise every time somebody says, "Show me your passport," yet again. How do we deal with that tension?
Well, in answer to your question, Mr. Davenport, I think the answer is that people have forgotten their history. We started with the Greeks and then were fast-forwarded to the 1700s, but wasn't there a very important thing in the middle called the Treaty of Westphalia? That's where national sovereignty first actually took place in Europe. And the concept of national sovereignty there wasn't actually to achieve something, it was to stop something nasty happening. And the Treaty of Westphalia was where basically the Church of Rome, which was like the supranational body, it was accountable to nobody other than itself. It had no truck with anybody having a say to it. It presumed itself infallible. And it was only when nation states started to get together and say, well, we don't like the look of this. That was actually where the concept of the nation's sovereignty started. So maybe the reason for that, Mr. Davenport, is because people have kind of forgotten the bit in the middle. And it's a bit like being a defender on a football field, isn't it? They don't win matches, but they stop that team from losing them. In that sense, it's stopping the supranational body with all its unaccountability, trampling over the lives and liberties of the nations under it. So maybe that's where the answer lies.
This is more of a rebuttal to Frank's argument about how the EU is scared to show about history and how Eastern Europe sees themselves as more Europe. That's a very hypocritical argument when you talk about, if you look at Hungarian history, most historians agree the reason Austria-Hungary fell was because the Hungarian were not willing to allow any other ethnic minority to have a say in the empire. They themselves wanted their own power. That's why Austria-Hungary fell. Also, Old Hungary, the massive kingdom, itself was a jailer of nations as well. They controlled Romanian lands, Slovakian lands, and Croatian lands, and crushed them every time they wanted their independence. With Poland, you can talk about how they want to defend their borders, but Poland's borders itself are an imagination of just drawn lines. Again, after World War II, the Polish, as well as most Eastern Europeans, committed a mass exodus of killing, evicting Germans from mostly German lands. So how can you, and also you got to look at a place like Spain, where I had Al-Andalus, that was a Muslim territory for 500 years. So you can argue that Europe itself has always been a multinational area. It's just people are using specific paths to argue what they're in favour in.
Thank you. Well, I do wonder whether we've got all the bits we need. It's kind of the discussion about anti-democratic. So it's the transnational aspect of the opposition to the nation state. The fact that we want to punt everything up to the EU and everything. But that consequently it's like an anti-democratic trend. And as Frank's argued, the defence of democracy is going to begin with the nation state. And so that's one aspect of it, the anti-democratic. It's like the vehicle through which they challenge democracy is to attack the nation state, just as much the vehicle through which we defend democracy is if you see what I mean. But then the other side of it, I think there's this whole question of identity politics that you alluded to. You talked about people wanting to belong, and it does seem that any identity that is collective is kind of under threat, challenged. Any identity that is very individuated, I now declare I'm a woman, or whatever, is praised and lauded. And I do wonder, just to come to a question, really, I doubt it's going to get answered, but this, there's not enough time, but for time reasons, I don't mean you couldn't answer it. You're perfectly capable of answering it. This idea of going back to fascism and explaining fascism in this book, Icarus Descended. She says we never really got to grips with fascism. We've never really explained fascism. And I wonder if that's something that needs to be done in order to almost rescue the nation state, get the chronology right and get the cause and effect right.
Yeah, well, that follows exactly on from my previous speaker, because when I read Frank's book and listening to this debate, I'm always fascinated how prominently Germany features in all of this. And Angie, you said there is no, Germany first. You mentioned that. Trump might say America first, but I've never heard, I'm from Germany, never heard a German politician saying Germany first. They would say Europe first, but not Germany first. So, Germans would say that we feel very, very European rather than German. So I'm wondering whether this kind of resolving of the national issue has somehow to do with resolving the German problem and the German issue. In one point of your book, you actually call the EU, you call it the EU-German way of dealing with history, and I think that's exactly what it is. And I think it's become very, very authoritarian towards Eastern Europe. So talking about Germany first would be wrong, but talking about Europe first is equally wrong, because Germany is imposing its own policies on Eastern European states. So the question is, what do we do about that? So it all comes back to that one question: what do we do about Europe? What do we do about Germany? What do we do about the EU?
Hi, I'd just like to know people's views on the question of citizenship, because, of course, for me, that seems to be the other side of the nation. And that also, in the context of Britain, has been problematic. I happen to carry a British passport. Am I British? Not really that bothered. But increasingly, it does become important when you are put in opposition to the European Union, for example, and you have to clarify and you have to really think hard about it. The problem for Britain is that citizenship itself has been tainted by racial history, the empire, and people very quickly assume for Britain that it is a racial identity. And I think maybe that's the positive thing about the whole Brexit discussion, is it is forcing us to really clarify what we mean by being European, what we mean by holding our politicians to account. And I think it's holding our politicians to account, which is the most critical thing about the Brexit thing, not necessarily whether or not I'm European.
Sorry, it's just a quick question prompted by the Germany First speaker. I'm trying to work out what Germany First would be in German, but it's probably a bad thing. European identity and national identity seem to have declined hand in hand. And I think people talk about European identity and being European, but isn't that equally as hard to pin down as the attempts to define British values? I mean, it harks back to something that's not there anymore. And I'm wondering, as national identity has been weakened and pathologized, so we're losing that distinctiveness that was by which we understood being European. Do the two need to thrive together, or do they decline together?
Angie, your closing remarks?
Thank you. So 2 comments particularly. I think it's perfectly natural, and it can even be healthy for many people to want to care about the nation or the nation state into which they were born, or where they live now, or where they were raised, or where their ancestors came from. That's not necessarily at all bad in itself, and I think it's quite natural. But it's crucial to hang on to the fact that the nation or nation state you are caring about is partly something you've imagined. And that is true for every single person on the planet, because never mind the political existence of separate nation states, how we think of that nation state is partly how we imagine it. And how we imagine it will be a selective mix of its history and of its varied languages, cultures, traditions, constitutions, ethnic and religious groups, and so on. If we hang on to the imaginary kind of construct that we've got and care about, that will help protect us from going down the routes of some of the more toxic forms of nationalism, which create a myth of a shared objective history of a nation or nation state. The second point is it's a question for us to end on because it's the biggest challenge of all, which we haven't had time to address in this debate. Frank talked about the importance of national sovereignty, and I wouldn't disagree with that, but it raises a huge issue which we haven't tackled, which is we've got round the edges of it. Quite a large numbers of people in the world at the moment don't like the way the world is currently divided up into nation states, and they want to create new nation states, different nation states. That has always been the case ever since the Treaty of Westphalia. Thank you for the Treaty of Westphalia. Kurdistan wants, some Kurdistan, people in Kurdistan want Kurdistan to be a separate nation state. We've obviously got it in Catalonia at the moment and elsewhere. Is it ever possible for new nation states to emerge without bloodshed? Well, historically, occasionally, yes, but very rarely. There's nearly always bloodshed. And so we've talked about current and past nation states. We have not addressed the really tough question about what do you do with imagined future nation states, and how do you address that issue? Is it possible to dissociate notions of a nation from a nation state so you can care deeply about your nation and its history and the community and the traditions, but feel that you can express that affection and caring, or at least see it as part of your personal narrative without wanting bloodily to create a new nation state?
Okay, thank you. Frank?
Yeah, I actually agree with your historical cast, to be true. I never suggested that Hungarians were angels or Poles were any different than anybody else. Well, I think they all have their weaknesses and they all committed horrible crimes in the past. All I was getting at was that if you have a people that feels that their independence has been taken away from them in their recent memory, the last 40, 50 years, then they will want to cherish that independence, sort of quite understandably. I think in this discussion, the really important question is not even national sovereignty, it's sovereignty. Because I think it's not an accident that people who are against or critical of national sovereignty are also very questioning about popular sovereignty and regard sovereignty as itself a dubious thing. And the central argument that you get time and time again is we live in a globalist world. The problems that we face are international. We cannot solve this problem unless all of us solve it. And that becomes an argument for taking away any notion of sovereignty as having any meaning. Because if all of us are solving it, then that's another way of saying that you're not solving it. Because how could you possibly deign to have a solution to this in your little village or your little country or whatever? And the argument is a very pernicious argument. Because if you're saying that the solution has got to be all of us, then what we are saying is that at the end of the day, it's going to be the people that are more or less are able to speak on behalf of all of us, and they usually are the usual suspect. The reason why we're having the discussion in the way that we're doing on the nation and nation state is because of the Nazi experience. The horrible experience of the Nazis in the Second World War has made everybody suspicious of nationalism, of the nation state. And that's why you will find that every time there's any discussion about nationalism, sooner or later somebody says that, oh, you're just like Hitler, or this is just like the 30s, because that's so powerfully imprinted on our historical memory. And what I would argue for is that if we're going to have a grown-up discussion on the nation state, we have to understand that the Nazi experience had many, many causes to it, and German nationalism was merely one of them. It was a far more complicated process, and it wasn't the inevitable outcome of nationalism by any means.
Okay, thank you. Can we give our panelists a round of applause, please?